Story 1. The Lantern Beyond the Tree Line. It was late in the season, one of those nights where the woods felt heavier than usual, when I was out doing patrol near the northern ridge. The trail was empty. Most hikers had already cleared out for the evening, and the temperature had dropped enough that I could see my breath. The air was still, not even the usual chatter of insects. I remember thinking it felt wrong, like the forest was holding itself in. That was when I noticed the glow. It wasn't bright, not at first, just a faint, warm flicker cutting through the blackness beyond the tree line. I thought it had to be a lantern, or maybe a fire left burning at a campsite that shouldn't have been there. Protocol said I should radio it in, wait for backup. But the glow was small, soft, like someone lost, maybe signaling for help. I called out, "Hello? Park Ranger, are you all right out there?" But the light only drifted, weaving between the trees, never coming closer. Something about the way it moved unsettled me. A lantern carried by a hand should bob, dip with each step, but this glow stayed smooth, gliding almost, like it wasn't tethered to anything. Still, I couldn't ignore the thought that someone might be hurt, so I stepped off the trail. My boots sank into the mossy ground, the quiet around me deepening as I went. The light always stayed just ahead, maybe 50 yards at most. No matter how fast I walked, no matter how much I called out, it never shrank, never grew. It just stayed, tempting me deeper. The woods out there are thick, and it doesn't take much to lose the trail. After a while, I glanced back, expecting to see the path right behind me, but it was gone. Nothing but rows of black trunks, stretching the same in every direction. I reached for my radio, pressed the button, and only static answered. A low hiss, broken by faint crackles like someone whispering just beneath the sound. I stopped walking then, realizing I couldn't hear my own footsteps anymore, couldn't hear anything but the radio's hiss. Even when I shut it off, the silence clung. I turned in a circle, searching for any landmark, a rock outcropping, a blaze painted on bark, but every angle looked the same. Pines closing in tight, shadows layered on shadows. The glow ahead flickered once, like it was waiting for me to notice, then steadied again. For the first time, I felt a chill that wasn't from the air. It wasn't guiding me towards safety. It was keeping me there, holding me just far enough to follow. I tried turning back, choosing one direction and walking straight. I told myself the trail couldn't be far, but after what felt like half an hour, I was still swallowed in trees. Every time I stopped, the glow appeared again in front of me, the same distance away, like it had circled back without moving. At some point, I looked at my watch. 11:42 p.m. I pressed on, desperate, my legs aching. The glow pulsed again, a quick dimming and brightening as though mocking me. I shouted at it then, my voice cracking through the silence. "What do you want?" The words hung in the air with no echo, just gone, swallowed. And then it vanished. No fade, no drifting away, just gone. The woods around me thickened with darkness, my eyes straining. That silence pressed so hard into my ears it felt physical, like a weight. I stood frozen, not knowing which direction to move. I swear I felt watched, though nothing stirred, not even a breath of wind. When I finally stumbled onto the marked trail again, my legs buckled with relief. I leaned against a post, chest heaving, before checking my watch. 3:04 a.m., over 3 hours had passed. I'd been gone long enough to cover miles. But my boots were barely muddy, my flashlight battery not even drained. I couldn't account for it. Back at the station, I filed the report, but nobody believed me. They joked it was a trick of the eyes, swamp gas, exhaustion. But when I close my eyes at night, I still see that glow floating ahead, always the same distance away. And what unsettles me most isn't what I saw, but the way it seemed to respond, almost deliberate, like it knew I'd follow. Even now, sometimes when I'm deep in the woods, far from anyone, I catch a faint glimmer out the corner of my eye. Always the same soft, steady flicker, waiting just beyond the trees. Story 2. The Empty Tent by the River. It was late summer, the river running low and sluggish after weeks without rain, when I found the tent. I'd been doing a sweep of the backcountry sites, making sure the permits lined up with the camps along the river. That stretch is quiet, tucked into a bend where the water slows and the trees lean close, their roots twisting out of the mud like ribs. I almost missed it at first. Canvas faded green against the underbrush. But when I stepped closer, I saw it wasn't on the list of approved sites. No permit tag tied to the zipper, no fire pit dug, no sign-in entry in the ledger. Just there. Like it had been dropped into place. I called out, expecting someone to answer, but the tent stayed silent. The zipper hung half open, flapping slightly in the breeze. I crouched at the entrance and shined my light inside. 2 sleeping bags, still unzipped, lay side by side. A paperback novel sat open on a page, as though someone had put it down only moments before. A pair of boots, damp and heavy-looking, rested neatly by the flap. That detail stuck with me. Most hikers kick them off, leave them tipped or muddy. These were lined up carefully, as if someone planned to step back into them at any second. What unsettled me most was the ground. The soil by the river is soft, and it always holds marks, boot prints, drag lines, animal tracks. But outside that tent, there was nothing. No prints leading in, none leading out. Just smooth dirt, slightly dark where it seemed pressed but undisturbed. I radioed it in, got only static before the line cleared. Dispatch told me no other rangers were nearby, no known campers unaccounted for. I was told to check the area and file a report in the morning. I stayed until dusk, circling out in wider and wider rings, but the woods were empty. No sound but the river moving slow and the occasional snap of a branch under my own boots. I came back to the tent after hours of searching, and the scene was unchanged. Bags open, book waiting, boots still damp. I decided to stay the night nearby, setting up by the bank with my flashlight angled at the tent. Part of me wanted to catch whoever it was, maybe scare them into coming back. Another part of me hoped I'd see nothing at all. The woods at night have their own way of closing in. Sound changes, carries strange. Around midnight, I woke to the noise of water slapping harder against stone, like something heavy had stepped into the river upstream. I sat up, heart thudding, straining to see. The water was calm under the moon. No ripples breaking its surface, but in the tent, the paperback had been flipped shut. The boots had shifted. They no longer sat side by side, but slightly apart, as though someone had stood in them briefly, then stepped back out. I didn't sleep after that. Every time I blinked, I half expected the zipper to slide open, someone to crawl out into the night. But nothing came. By the first light of dawn, I gathered myself, walked back to the tent ready to note everything in detail, except there was nothing there. No canvas, no poles, no scraps of nylon. The grass where it had stood was unbent, the dirt smooth. Even the damp patch beneath where the boots had been had dried as though weeks had passed. I thought maybe another ranger had come before me, broken protocol and taken it down without logging. But when I asked at the station later that morning, no one admitted to being out that way. Records showed nothing. It was as if I had imagined the whole scene. Still, I can't shake the details. The sleeping bags still open. The book paused mid-story. Those boots, dark with river water, waiting at the flap. I went back to that bend weeks later. The river had dropped even lower, exposing more stone and root. I searched the bank carefully, hands shaking, though I told myself I was just being thorough. I found no sign of the tent, but the air there felt heavier somehow, charged in a way I can't explain. and when I leaned down to touch the soil, it was damp, just in that one patch where the tent had once stood, though the rest of the ground was dry and cracked. I never filed that part in the report. Some things don't make it onto paper, but I'll tell you this. Every time I walk past a campsite and see boots sitting neat at the flap, I feel that old unease crawling back up my spine. Like someone stepped out for just a second, but they're watching, waiting to step back in the moment I look away. Story 3, Whispers on the Old Fire Tower. The old fire tower sat on the edge of a ridge, its frame rusting, its wood weathered grey from decades of storms. It hadn't been in use since the 70s, but every so often, rangers were sent to inspect it, just to make sure kids weren't climbing it, or vandals hadn't started stripping it for scrap. I didn't mind the walk. It was isolated, a mile off any trail, tucked where the woods thickened and the ground sloped steep. By the time I reached it, the sun was always sinking low, and the structure would loom out of the trees like a skeleton of iron and pine. One evening, I went later than I should have. The light had gone soft. That grey-blue tone the mountains take just before night swallows them whole. I started up the staircase, hand on the rail, listening to the groan of metal beneath my boots. Halfway up, I stopped. At first, I thought the wind was moving through the frame, but then I realized it wasn't wind at all. It was voices. They were faint, carried down from the top. Two men, low and steady, murmuring in tones I couldn't make out. Not words, just the cadence of speech, like an argument simmering under breath. My chest tightened. Nobody had clearance to be up there. I gripped the rail harder and called out, "Hello! Park Service!" The voices didn't stop. They wove around each other, rising and falling, as though whoever was up there hadn't heard me at all. I took another step, then another. My boots clanged on the grating, each sound too sharp against their muffled tones. The higher I climbed, the more they seemed to sink into themselves, fading but still present, until just before I reached the top platform, they cut off. Silence, so sudden it rang in my ears. I stood frozen, my breath loud, my heart hammering. At the top, the cabin door hung open. I pushed it with 2 fingers and stepped inside. Dust coated the floor, thick as ash. Cobwebs stitched the corners. The table and chair left decades ago sat untouched, wood warped but solid. Nobody had been in there, not in years. Yet the air still felt moved, unsettled, like something had just slipped out moments before I entered. I stayed only long enough to sweep my flashlight across the room. No tracks, no sign of life, nothing but the smell of rust and old wood. I backed out, steadying myself, telling my pulse to calm. But as soon as I set foot on the stairs again, the murmurs started up. Not above me, this time, beneath. I froze. The voices rose from the staircase below, the same low, steady exchange. Closer now, sharper. I felt the vibration in the rail beneath my hand. I leaned out, looking down through the grating, but the stairwell was empty all the way to the ground. The sound didn't match the sight. Every step down, the voices seemed to follow just beneath, always one flight lower. I tried calling out again, louder this time, but the words caught in my throat, came out thin. The murmurs never wavered, never acknowledged me. By the time I hit the halfway point, my hands shook so badly I nearly slipped. When I reached the bottom, the voices vanished. The woods waited in stillness, thick shadows pressing in. My flashlight beam stretched thin through the pines, but nothing stirred. It was as though the sound had been swallowed whole, leaving only my ragged breath in its place. I locked the gate on that tower before I left, securing the chain as tight as it would go. The walk back was long, the night falling heavy, and every step I kept glancing behind, certain I'd hear those murmurs again on the wind. But the woods stayed quiet. Later, When I mentioned it to one of the older rangers, he didn't laugh. He just stared at me a long moment, then said, "You went up there after dark?" I nodded, unsure. His mouth tightened and he shook his head. "That tower's got its own echoes. Best you don't climb it again." He wouldn't explain more, and I didn't ask. Some things you don't push, but I've thought about it often since. The way the voices never formed words, only the sound of men locked in an endless argument. The way they shifted, moving from above to beneath, like they were circling me, hemming me in. I never went back to that tower at night. I avoid even passing by it if I can. Still, when the wind's right, carrying over the ridge, I sometimes swear I catch the faintest hum of voices drifting through the trees. Not clear, never words, just that same steady murmur, waiting on the air as though the tower hasn't forgotten me. Story 4. The Woman at the Trail's End. It was early spring, and the fog in the mountains came thicker than usual. I had taken to walking a certain trail near my cabin, a path I knew well, worn into the earth by decades of boots before mine. That morning, the fog lay heavy like wool, muting the forest into shadows and pale grey outlines. The air was damp, and every step I took seemed muffled, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. I remember thinking it was too quiet. No birds, no squirrels darting, not even the sound of water trickling from the streams. Just me, my boots, and the hush that pressed down from all sides. I don't know what made me look up when I did. At the far end of the trail, where it opened into a small clearing, I saw her, a woman, standing perfectly still. Her figure was faint through the fog, like a smear of color on a wet canvas, but it grew clearer as I walked. She was barefoot. Her dress was blue once, but faded, torn at the hem, clinging damp against her legs. Long, dark hair hung loose and unkempt, covering most of her face. The way she stood, head slightly bent, arms slack at her sides, was what unnerved me most. Not frightened, not lost, just waiting, I called out. Just a simple hello. Because what else do you say to someone standing alone in the fog? She didn't move, didn't look up. I called again, louder this time, and then she shifted. Not toward me. She turned away, slow and deliberate, and stepped off the trail into the mist. Something about that movement pulled me forward. I can't explain why. Instinct should have told me to leave it alone, but I found myself hurrying down the trail, calling after her, my boots snapping twigs and scattering stones. When I reached the clearing, I stopped. The fog there was thicker, curling low across the ground like smoke. I scanned the tree line, expecting to see her silhouette vanish deeper into the woods. But there was nothing, not even the faintest shape, just empty fog and the skeletal outlines of trees. I glanced down at the earth, damp with last night's rain. My own footprints pressed dark into the mud. Hers should have been beside them, smaller, lighter, but there was nothing. It was as if she hadn't been there at all. What struck me hardest wasn't her absence, but the smell that hung in the air. Sweet, strong, completely out of place. Lilacs, the perfume was thick enough to taste, cloying against the back of my throat. I don't know how long I stood there, breathing it in, staring at nothing. Eventually, the smell faded, leaving only the damp rot of leaves and earth. I didn't tell anyone right away. Around here, people are used to stories. Feral folk in the hollows, lights in the trees, voices in the caves. Most brushed them off with a laugh or a drink, and I wasn't sure which I wanted more. But a week later, curiosity pulled me back. I signed the hiker's log at the trailhead, a habit more for tradition than safety, and flipped through the pages. That's when I saw it. A note scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting, dated just 3 days before. Fog was thick. Saw a woman at the end of the trail, blue dress, barefoot. Didn't speak, just vanished. My stomach dropped as I read it again and again. The description was exact. Same dress, same silence. I don't believe in coincidences when it comes to things like this. And it wasn't just me. Wasn't just some trick of fog and imagination. I started asking around quietly, careful not to sound foolish. A man at the general store squinted at me when I mentioned the trail and said, "You talking about the lilac woman?" He said it the way you'd mention a local superstition, half joking, half serious. He wouldn't elaborate, only shook his head and muttered, "Best not to look too hard for things that don't want to be found." That should have been the end of it. But the image of her stuck with me. That stillness, the deliberate way she turned away. It gnawed at me, filled my dreams with fog and the faint rustle of footsteps that never quite reached me. Against my better judgment, I went back again and again. Always in the mornings when the fog pooled low and the woods seemed caught between waking and sleep. Sometimes the trail was empty, just me and the grey hush. But twice more, I saw her, always at the far end, always standing just still enough to feel wrong. And each time, she stepped away before I could get closer, dissolving into mist. The lilac scent lingered like a ghost of breath on my neck. The last time I saw her was different. The fog was so dense I could barely see 10 feet ahead, the world reduced to damp air and the crunch of my boots. I felt her before I saw her, a prickling awareness that pulled my eyes forward. She was there, closer than before, maybe 30 yards away. For the first time, her head lifted slightly, and I thought I caught a glimpse of her face through the veil of hair, pale skin, hollowed eyes that didn't blink. She didn't turn this time, she just stood, watching me, waiting. I should have gone to her. I don't know why I didn't. My body locked, my throat dry as stone. We stayed that way, two figures in the fog, until a crow called overhead and broke whatever spell had me frozen. I blinked, and she was gone. Not a sound of retreating footsteps, not a shift of fabric in the mist, just gone. The smell of lilacs hit me so strong it made my eyes water, and then it too was gone, leaving only the damp rot of the woods. I stopped going to the trail after that. The thought of seeing her again, closer still, filled me with a dread I can't describe. It wasn't fear of her exactly. It was the feeling that if I saw her face fully, if I let her draw me one step closer, something in me would never come back. I still walk the woods sometimes, but not on that trail. And every spring when the fog rolls thick through the trees, I keep to my porch and wait for it to pass. Sometimes, even from home, I swear I catch it. The faintest trace of lilacs on the wind, sweet and wrong, threading through the pines. And when I do, I know she's out there, waiting. Story 5. The radio call that wasn't there. I was midway through my usual night shift when it happened, the kind of night that already presses on your chest with its stillness and the low hum of the forest around the ranger station. The wind had dropped, the usual whisper of trees absent, and even the crickets seemed cautious. I was sipping lukewarm coffee and checking the radio, the static crackling in soft bursts, when a voice came through that made me drop the cup. At first, I thought it was a prank, someone playing with the frequency, but there was a raw panic in it, a trembling edge that didn't belong to anyone fooling around. The voice called out coordinates, precise and urgent, over and over, each syllable punctuated by gasps and a choking sound, like he couldn't catch his breath. I immediately logged the coordinates and keyed my handheld to respond, but as I started moving, the forest seemed to close in. My own radio cut out mid-call, static swallowing the last of his words, leaving me in a silence that was heavier than the night itself. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the coordinates, the beam slicing through the darkness, but doing little to ease the creeping dread that settled in my chest. The trail was narrow, overgrown in parts, with the fog rising low over the moss and roots. I kept expecting something to move, a shadow darting behind a tree, the sound of footsteps that weren't mine, but there was only the muffled crunch of my own boots. As I neared the site, the air grew colder, the damp smell of earth thick in my nose, and the radio remained dead at my side. That silence gnawed at me more than anything else. Finally, the clearing opened up, and there it was. Or rather, wasn't. The coordinates led me to a dilapidated ranger station I knew had been abandoned decades ago. Boards had been nailed across the windows, the padlock rusted shut, the roof sagging in the middle. I shone the flashlight inside, the beam catching on dust motes that swirled in the stagnant air. Nothing moved, no sounds except the soft groan of timber settling, the faint whistle of wind squeezing through the gaps. And yet, the panic in the voice lingered in my mind, so visceral I could almost hear it echoing off the walls. I circled the building, tapping on boards, listening for the hollow sound of someone trapped inside, but there was nothing. No footprints, no tracks, no sign of recent human presence. I pulled out my phone, trying to call dispatch, and heard only the dial tone. Static started flickering on the handheld radio again, a soft whisper of white noise, and then it stopped entirely. Dispatch finally came back, their voices flat and calm, and I asked about any other rangers on duty that night. They told me firmly that there was nobody else on the air, no one who could have made the call. My stomach turned over at that confirmation. The voice I'd heard, desperate and fading, couldn't have come from anywhere I could reach, not from anyone alive, at least anyone I could verify. I stood there in the clearing, flashlight hovering over the padlocked door, the forest pressing in, and I felt the weight of the decades that had passed since that station was operational. Later, back at the station, I started digging through old records, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. The coordinates matched exactly the location of this abandoned station, which had been shut down after a flood in 1979. A ranger had gone missing then, last heard through a call logged on the books, and though dispatch had recorded his coordinates and final words, the recording itself was never captured. The details lined up almost too perfectly. The desperation, the phrasing, even the exact tone of panic that had echoed through my radio. My hands trembled as I read the transcripts, the hairs on my neck standing straight. I'd spoken to that voice, in some way, decades after the man vanished, and the thought of it churned uneasily in my gut. I kept returning to the same questions. Had it been some strange atmospheric anomaly carrying his voice through the wires? A glitch in the frequencies that somehow picked up a memory from the past? Or had I stumbled across something that defied all logic? Some residue of a tragedy left lingering in the very air around the station? Each theory felt as hollow as the building itself, and I couldn't shake the image of that man, trapped and shouting coordinates into a void that had already swallowed him whole. At night, I lie awake thinking of the static, that trembling, urgent sound, and I hear it again in the creak of the office walls, in the rustle of the trees outside. I went back once more during the day, trying to confirm the coordinates, to see if the station had somehow been accessed by someone else, but it remained locked and abandoned, just as it always had. No footprints, no signs of tampering, nothing to indicate anyone had been there for decades. I spoke to a few older rangers who had been on duty at the time of the flood, and they remembered the disappearance vaguely, how the man had called in during the rising waters and then was never seen again. They spoke of it like it was a closed case, a cautionary tale for young rangers, but their words didn't match the immediacy of what I'd heard. The fear I'd felt wasn't something from a story. It had been real, raw, and it was still with me. Sometimes, when the wind is right, I think I can still hear it. Not every night, but occasionally, when the forest presses close and the silence is thick, a faint voice cracks over the static of my radio, coordinates whispered into the dark like a warning or a plea. I can't pinpoint where it comes from, and I'm too far along to pretend it's nothing. The station itself sits abandoned, crumbling, yet somehow the memory of that night is as alive as if the man was still standing there, calling out across the decades. I've told dispatch to keep the frequency clear at night, but even then, I can't be certain what I'll hear next. There's a weight to knowing that something, or someone, remains just beyond reach, speaking in a language that time itself can't erase. And in the quiet moments, when I'm alone and the forest is alive with unseen movement, I remember the sheer urgency of that voice. And I can't convince myself it was anything less than a human being in distress. But who or what could cross the span of decades and reach me like that? I still don't have an answer, and the not knowing sits heavier than any danger I've faced on patrol. I haven't gone back at night since. I make my rounds in daylight, keeping my eyes on the paths and the underbrush, listening for the ordinary noises of the forest. But I know they are only the ordinary noises on the surface. Beneath it all, there is that voice, and it waits, somewhere between static and memory, a reminder that some calls never truly go unanswered. And I keep thinking, every time the wind drops and the radio crackles faintly, that maybe, just maybe, I'm still on the receiving end of a call from someone who never made it out, someone still lost in the space where time and fear converge, and all I can do is listen. Story 6, The Unmarked Grave. Beside the trail, I'd been working as a seasonal ranger in the northern stretches of the Appalachians for a few years, used to the quiet solitude of those back trails and the way the forest seemed to shift when no one else was around. Most days, the isolation didn't bother me. In fact, it was comforting, the kind of emptiness that made every bird call or snap of a twig feel alive, intimate. But there are some corners of those woods that carry a weight, and one of those corners was a narrow, overgrown trail that hikers had begun to whisper about. A week before I first went out there, dispatch had gotten reports of people stumbling over bones in the dirt, though no one could give a clear location. When I finally traced the path, I found what they'd meant. Half hidden by tangled roots and underbrush, a shallow grave lay exposed. Fragments of a jawbone jutted through loose soil, ribs breaking the surface as if they had been turned over in a fit of careless curiosity. There were no markers, no cairn, no sign of any ceremony, just dirt pushed aside in what had been, unmistakably, a recent dig. The air around the site felt heavy, almost unnatural. I flagged the area, took photographs, and filed the report, thinking perhaps it had been some morbid prank. But something about the earth unsettled me, the way it looked freshly turned yet already settling, the faint scent of iron and damp moss clinging to it. The trees around the clearing were too still, as if holding their breath. I remembered the hikers' insistence that they hadn't imagined it. Even then, I thought I'd chalk that up to nerves and imagination, the kind that creeps in after a long walk alone. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, not by animals, but by something older, something patient. 2 days later, I returned with a small team, expecting to catalogue and perhaps retrieve what was left. But when we reached the spot, the grave had vanished. It was gone with such precision it looked impossible. The dirt was smooth, pressed flat as if it had never been disturbed. The grass and moss that had grown along the edge of the pit were back in place, flattened against the soil like someone had carefully tamped them down with hands I couldn't see. No fragments, no trace. No shadow of the grave that had so clearly been there just days before. My stomach tightened, a cold, knotting awareness that I wasn't supposed to see this. I looked at my team, and they were just as bewildered. All of us standing in silence, staring at the perfectly even patch of earth. I asked the hikers to show me the exact spot again, retracing their path, their memories jittering between panic and disbelief. Each of them insisted they hadn't imagined it. The jaw, the ribs, the uneven soil, the feeling that the earth had been holding something alive in its secrecy. But standing there now, I could see nothing. No footprints, no scraps of bone, not even the slight indent of a grave. The forest around us hummed quietly with wind through leaves and the distant echo of a stream, but there was nothing else. Nothing to anchor the memory of what had been so real just 2 days prior. The unease stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about how fast the earth had healed itself, or who, or what, had taken the time to do it. I began hiking that trail more often, sometimes in the early morning when the mist hung low and every root and stone seemed magnified. I would pause at the area, studying the ground with a ranger's trained eye, yet it always appeared as if nothing had ever been there. Occasionally, I'd catch glimpses of something that didn't belong, a darker patch of soil that seemed almost wet despite no recent rain, or a fleeting movement at the periphery of my vision. Every time I turned, nothing was there. The locals I spoke with were quiet, wary, and oddly dismissive when I mentioned it. One old man muttered about the earth keeping secrets it don't owe nobody, and another suggested that the forest had a way of swallowing its dead. But those were just words, stories passed down to keep kids from wandering too far. They didn't explain the meticulous smoothing of soil I had seen. They didn't explain the feeling of eyes lingering on me as I walked, or the soft but unmistakable shift in the ground beneath my boots, like the earth itself was alive and aware. A week after the team returned, I hiked alone at dusk, the fog rolling in thick and damp, sticking to my clothes and chilling my skin. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that the grave had been some natural mishap, bones from an animal, perhaps, but my own memories refused to cooperate. I reached the site again, the same patch of impossibly even soil, and knelt to examine it closely. The earth was soft, yielding beneath my fingers, and the smell hit me then, faint but sharp, coppery, like blood long left to the soil, mixed with something sweeter, lilac or something similar. Almost floral in its pungency. My throat tightened. I felt the hairs on my arms rise, and I swore I heard a faint scraping sound, like fingernails against packed dirt, coming from directly below the smooth surface. I scrambled back to the trail, my flashlight swinging wildly, heart hammering, but when I glanced over my shoulder, the forest was still, silent, and empty. I tried calling dispatch on my radio, and for a moment I thought I heard a voice crackle faintly through, but it was just static. Whatever had been there, or whatever had moved the bones, was gone, leaving only the lingering smell, the impossibly perfect soil, and the sense that I had disturbed something that was not meant to be disturbed. Since then, I avoid that part of the trail whenever I can. I check maps and logs, talk to hikers, but no one reports anything consistent. Some have mentioned seeing roots or small mounds of soil out of place, and I know better than to dismiss them. I think about the grave often, and every time I do, the hair on the back of my neck stands up, and the forest seems to hold its breath around me. I've considered going back with a larger crew, even excavation tools, but a voice in the back of my mind tells me it wouldn't help. Some things in the forest are not meant to be uncovered, and some secrets, once disturbed, demand respect, or caution at the very least. I still hike those woods, sometimes alone, sometimes with company, but I never approach that trail's back stretch after the first half mile. Even now, years later, I pass it cautiously, and my eyes inevitably drift to that even patch of soil. It's too perfect, too deliberate, like someone, or something, went to great lengths to erase its presence, and I always catch myself wondering, with a shiver, whether it's watching when I do, whether it waits for the next curious footstep, the next person daring to see what the earth wants to keep hidden. The memory doesn't fade, and I know it never will. Every creak of a branch, every whisper of wind reminds me that the forest holds its secrets, and some of them might still be alive. Story 7. The Footsteps Around My Cabin. I never thought much about the loneliness when I first took the ranger cabin out in the deep section of the park. It was the kind of place people warned you about when they said, "Don't wander too far. The woods have eyes." At the time, I figured that was just talk, a way to keep inexperienced hikers from wandering into mudslides or bear country. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, perched on a ridge with pines pressing close on either side. It had a stove, a narrow loft, and a single creaky door with a lock that didn't quite line up. At night, though, the silence was something else. The forest seemed to fold in on itself, pressing against the walls in a way that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand straight. At first, I told myself it was the wind, or deer moving through the underbrush. But then came the footsteps. They started slow, a deliberate crunching against the leaf litter and pine needles outside the cabin. I'd be lying in my cot, reading the ranger manual or filling out logs, and the sound would drift in through the cracks in the windows. Not a scattered, panicked tread. These were measured, careful, like someone was tracing the cabin's perimeter in a kind of ritual. At first, I went to the windows and shined my flashlight out, thinking maybe a hiker had gotten lost or a hunter was wandering too close. Nothing, just the darkened shapes of trees, rigid and still. No footprints, no sign anyone had walked there at all. I started staying up later, trying to catch the pattern. The steps never entered the cabin, never pounded on the door. They circled, always outside, sometimes stopping for a long moment beneath a window or the edge of the porch. Once, I could have sworn I heard a shift in the dirt, a soft scraping sound like someone kneeling. My pulse hammered, and I forced myself to shine the light out in that direction. Nothing, just the ordinary night sounds, the creak of pine, the distant call of an owl, the sighing wind through the ridge. I began leaving doors locked, the stove cold. Every precaution a thin barrier between me and whoever, or whatever, was circling. One night, I tried to catch it. I had a bag of flour I used for marking trail samples and decided to leave a ring around the cabin's base, thinking at least then I'd see footprints if someone had been sneaking around. I went to bed with the cabin quiet, except for the normal rustling outside, and by morning, the flour was gone. Every trace swept clean, as if it had never been there. No footprints leading away, no disruption in the surrounding dirt, no wind pattern that could have carried it off. I felt sick, knowing that whatever had passed through didn't just move with care, it erased itself entirely. After that, I couldn't sleep. I started setting the camera traps I had for monitoring wildlife around the ridge, thinking maybe I could catch a deer or bobcat. Weeks went by. The cameras would flash and click, but nothing ever appeared on the tapes during the night hours when the footsteps came, and the footsteps kept circling, always at night, always slow, deliberate, never rushing. There was a rhythm to them, a patience that made my skin crawl. They weren't trying to scare me in a hurry, just to exist alongside me in the same space, to remind me I wasn't alone. I mentioned it to the dispatcher once, thinking maybe someone else had noticed odd things near their cabins. "You've been out there too long," they joked, but I didn't laugh. That kind of isolation changes you. Your imagination starts to fill the gaps in ways that feel like memory. Every creak of the loft, every pine needle falling on the roof, became a footstep in my mind. Yet I knew the difference between imagination and reality. This was real. Weeks of it. Nights where the air seemed to hold its breath until I went outside, flashlight trembling in hand to see nothing at all. I stopped going out at night. Meals stayed cold longer. I made a little trail of salt along the perimeter in one desperate, childish attempt to mark boundaries. By morning, it had shifted, the line broken, as if trampled by someone careful enough to leave no footprints. That's when I realized the patience wasn't just in the footsteps. They were waiting somehow for me to move, to acknowledge them. The cabin, my supposed sanctuary, was just another stage, and I, an unwilling audience, trapped inside the play. I started keeping a journal of the occurrences, careful to note times, weather conditions, and the slightest variations in sound. Some nights, I could hear them circling almost in rhythm with my own breathing. Other nights, a pause, and then the faintest brushing along the porch roof, like someone leaning close just to look in. I never saw a shadow, never glimpsed a figure, just the pattern of footsteps shifting around me in the dark. Each night, I woke to find the doorknob with no scratches, the ground around the cabin untouched, the flour and salt vanished. Whoever, or whatever, was out there had mastered a discipline I couldn't comprehend. By the third week, I noticed small things. A twig bent differently, a slight indentation in the moss near the foundation, a hollow sound beneath the porch as if something heavy had shifted, then gone. I stopped trying to trace it. I stopped trying to reason with it. I just stayed awake, listening to the slow march outside my windows, hoping it would end, knowing it wouldn't. One night, when the fog rolled in, the footsteps slowed as if unsure whether to continue. I watched the dim light from my stove flicker against the walls, listening to the earth underfoot pressing down in silence for long moments. And then they resumed. Just beyond the veil of mist, slow and deliberate, patient in a way that suggested awareness. I left that cabin after 6 weeks, but the footsteps never left my mind. I could see them in the corners of my apartment, hear them when the wind hit the window the wrong way. I told myself leaving would be enough, that the isolation had made me hallucinate. But friends who hike those back trails sometimes tell me they hear the same slow circling at night, pause beneath a window or porch, then gone. I can't say if it's a person, a watcher, some remnant of the woods, or something else entirely. All I know is that when you're out there, deep in the forest where the earth presses against the cabin and the fog rolls down the ridge, you realize the silence is never empty. There's always someone, or something, walking just beyond the edge of vision, waiting for you to notice, patient enough to circle the night, and careful enough to leave no trace. I think of that cabin every time I pass a ridge like that, and I swear I can still hear the faint, deliberate crunch of footsteps circling just outside, waiting. Story 8, the crying in the gorge. I remember that night in the gorge as if it's etched into my bones. It wasn't my first solo patrol, not by a long shot, but something about that section of the park had always put me on edge. The gorge is narrow, steep-walled and unnaturally quiet, except for the way sound twists and lingers there. A shout thrown from the lip of the cliff will bounce and ripple, sometimes returning distorted, as though the canyon itself is playing a cruel trick. I'd hiked it dozens of times, checked the trails, and yet I never felt entirely alone. That night, the air was heavy, damp with the smell of wet leaves and rotting wood, and the mist rolled along the cliffs in a slow, crawling haze. My flashlight caught the shine of wet rock, and every snap of a twig beneath my boots felt louder than it had any right to. I was midway through my patrol when I heard it. Soft at first, almost delicate, the high, broken wail of a child. My stomach tightened. The sound came from the gorge below, and the way it carried made it impossible to tell how far. I froze, gripping my flashlight tighter, telling myself it was probably a lost hiker, someone out after dark by mistake, but the voice was weak, fragile. The kind that makes you flinch even in the safety of your own home. "Help, please," it called. The desperation in it twisted in my chest, and I didn't think twice. I scrambled down the steep trail, roots tangling beneath my boots, the flashlight beam slicing through the fog. Every step made the cry sharper, louder, or so it seemed. But the harder I tried to pinpoint it, the further it seemed to retreat, always just beyond the brush or around a bend. By the time I reached the creek at the bottom, my lungs burning and knees slick with mud, the crying stopped. I stood there, flashlight trembling in my hands, scanning the water and the shadows beneath overhanging boulders. The creek gurgled over stones, calm and indifferent, and there was nothing else. No child, no figure, no trace of a lost hiker, only the cold water and the lingering echo of what I thought I'd heard. I called up the canyon, letting my voice carry, hoping for some response, but the gorge swallowed my own words. For a long moment, I considered that I'd imagined it. The combination of isolation, the mist, the way the forest bends sound. But the sound had been too precise, too real. I began climbing back up, each step deliberate. The flashlight cutting a narrow path through the creeping fog. My boots slid on the loose dirt, and the mist clung to my jacket, soaking through to my skin. Then I heard it again, higher up, where I had just been, a thin, ragged sob, identical to the one from the creek. My stomach lurched. I froze mid-step, straining to hear. The crying was the same tone, the same fractured cadence, and it seemed to move just as I did, always staying out of reach. I stopped, holding my breath, thinking maybe the gorge had some strange acoustic anomaly, but that didn't account for the timing. It wasn't echoing, it was deliberate, following me, waiting. I didn't chase it again. I wanted to, part of me, but a sharper instinct, one older than any training, told me to stop. I've been on enough patrols to know that when something in the forest wants to be left alone, it will make you pay for ignoring the warning. I stayed where I was, letting the fog drift around me, the sobs retreating up the gorge, retreating with a patience that unsettled me more than fear ever could. I climbed the last section in silence, every sound magnified in the cold night. At the ridge, I paused, breathing heavily, listening. The forest was quiet except for the wind rustling through the bare trees, and for a long time, there was nothing. I tried to rationalize it afterward. Lost child, prank, animal making strange sounds in the canyon. I checked the ranger logs and local reports. Nothing missing, no hikers overdue, no reports of anyone in the gorge that night. Even the occasional echoing cry in the park's deeper sections didn't match the tone of what I heard. This was human. I know it was human. And yet, when I returned to the creek a week later, there was no sign. No footprints, no child, not even the disturbed leaves and mud that had marked my own path. It was as though nothing had happened, except for the memory of that voice following me uphill. A sound that no echo should have been able to make. I avoided that section of the park for months after, always steering patrols around the gorge, even when I was alone and the night was quiet. But every so often, when the mist rolls down low and the air feels thick, I swear I hear the same thin, broken call drifting up from somewhere unseen. Sometimes when I walk the ridges above the gorge, I pause, heart hammering, scanning the shadows, and for a heartbeat I think I catch movement down below, a flicker of clothing, or perhaps just the fog itself, but it's always gone before I can be sure. I've told fellow rangers, but they just nod, hum, and dismiss it as imagination. They haven't walked the bottom of that canyon at night, haven't listened to the forest bend sound like it has a mind of its own. It's been years now, and the memory has only sharpened more than a single night could warrant. I remember the cold water on my boots, the way the mist seemed to curl like fingers around my legs, and the sobbing voice, impossibly near yet impossibly distant. I remember the frustration of trying to reach it, to save it, to reassure myself that someone wasn't lost or hurt, only to find the creek empty and indifferent. That helplessness is what haunts me the most. The realization that some things can be right in front of you, and yet completely out of reach. I still patrol the park, still hike the trails, but I avoid the gorge if I can. When the wind is just so, carrying leaves and branches down the slopes, I hear what I thought I had left behind. The sobbing, calling, drifting voice that cannot be caught, cannot be reasoned with, and yet insists on following you. It waits. It always waits. And sometimes when the fog is thick and the night is quiet, I wonder if I ever truly left that canyon, or if a piece of me still lingers down there, listening for the impossible sound that refuses to be quiet. It's a weight I carry, the knowledge that the forest can be patient, and that there are places where sound itself becomes a trap, and nothing, not even time, can undo what you've heard. I cannot explain what it was, and I fear I never will. But the next time I pass the gorge, I will slow my pace, feel the mist on my skin, and brace myself, because somewhere down there, it is still waiting. The voice that called for help, the sound of a child in trouble that never was, and perhaps never will be, drifts up from the shadows, reminding me that the forest holds its own logic, one I may never understand, and that some cries are meant never to be answered. Story 9. The vanished campsite on the ridge. I remember checking in that group of campers like it was yesterday, though the memory feels fuzzed around the edges now, like it's caught in a smoke I can't quite breathe through. 3 permits, all signed, all perfectly routine, and I even waved them off with the usual reminders about fire safety and wildlife. It was early morning when I saw them heading up the trail toward the ridge, backpacks sitting heavy on their shoulders, laughter carrying faintly down to the trailhead. The ridge itself was quiet, tucked into a bend of the mountainside where the wind carried differently, and the trees leaned close like they were eavesdropping. I thought nothing of it at the time, just another summer outing in the park. But something about the way the morning fog clung to that ridge always made me uneasy, a weight in the air that didn't belong. 2 days later, I decided to verify the campsite. Routine procedure, nothing more. Though a small voice in the back of my head told me to take my time, to be careful. I followed the trail up, the pine needles crunching beneath my boots, branches scraping at my jacket, and the ridge loomed ahead with that same strange silence I'd noticed before. When I reached the clearing where I knew the campers were supposed to be, the scene froze me in place. Fire pit cold and unscathed. No smoke, no scent of burned wood. Tents gone, backpacks gone, not a scrap of litter or disturbance in the dirt. It was as though the ridge had never seen them, though the car was still parked at the trailhead below, shiny and real. I circled the clearing, flashlight cutting through the shadows, scanning for footprints, signs, anything, but there was nothing, only the wind threading through the pines, carrying a faint hum that wasn't quite the wind. I radioed it in, filed the report, and went back down the trail, my stomach twisting as I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they left earlier than planned, maybe someone had given them a ride, maybe I was just seeing things, but something in that ridge had shifted, or maybe it had always been waiting, and it was patient enough to hide whatever had happened. Weeks passed, reports were filed, and the disappearance became an open file in the ranger station. Just another entry in a long list of lost hikers, though I knew in my gut this one was different. I kept checking the ridge whenever I could, though I never told anyone how often I climbed it just to stare at the empty clearing, waiting for some proof that reality hadn't snapped. It was late afternoon the next time I hiked up, the sun starting to dip behind the western hills, painting everything in molten orange. As I crested the last rise, I froze. There, exactly where the campsite had been, I saw the faint glow of firelight flickering in the encroaching shadows. My first thought was reflection from the dying sun, but the glow pulsed, shifted, as though the fire was breathing. Heart hammering, I approached cautiously, boots silent on the softened soil. When I got closer, the fire was gone, replaced by a cold ring of ash, old and damp, buried in the shadows like the mountain had swallowed it whole. I kicked at the dirt lightly, trying to feel the heat that wasn't there, and the silence pressed in until it was almost unbearable. Nothing moved except for the pine needles trembling in the wind, and for a moment I could almost hear something running through the trees above, fast, deliberate, and unseen. The ridge held me for hours that evening, as if it were daring me to leave. The forest smelled different up there, heavier, the moss darker, and the air thick with a tension I couldn't name. I've hiked these mountains for years, seen bear tracks and snake dens, heard mountain lions scream at dusk, but nothing had ever felt like this. I finally descended, exhausted, and swore I saw the faint glow again, dancing just over the crest where the campsite should have been. I tried to convince myself it was memory, imagination, a trick of the fading light, but that glow kept returning, always in the same spot, always just out of reach. Weeks became months. Rangers talked about the missing campers in hushed tones, theories bouncing between early departures and wilderness accidents, but no one could explain why the ridge remained empty, untouched, yet carried that strange pulse of life when I climbed it. Sometimes, when dusk settles and the air cools, I'll pass the trailhead and notice a faint haze above the ridge, the suggestion of firelight or a gathering I cannot see. I've hiked it alone since, always careful, always alert, but the ridge doesn't behave the way it should. Footfalls seem muffled, shadows hang wrong, and that glow flickers, sometimes brighter, sometimes dimmer, but never enough to touch. Last autumn, I took a patrol with a trainee, hoping someone else could see, could confirm, could explain. I pointed toward the ridge just as the sun disappeared behind the western peaks. "There," I said, "see that? Right there." Where their campsite was. He squinted, shaking his head. "Nothing," he said. "It's just trees." I tried to describe the glow, the way the clearing looked alive for a moment before it vanished, the heavy hush that pressed against the ears, but he didn't understand. I didn't blame him. I still don't fully understand myself. We left before night fell, but as we drove down the trailhead, I kept glancing back, and there it was again, a tiny, flickering light, dancing over damp ash and old dirt. No smoke, no warmth, just that impossible flame. Now, years later, I walk near the ridge and still feel it. Hikers pass, laughing, calling, setting up tents where I know none will remain, and the ridge waits. Sometimes, late at night in my cabin, I dream of the glow, rising and falling, and I wake with my heart pounding, the forest around me unnervingly silent. I don't know what happened to those campers, or if they're even gone at all, though rationally I know the odds are grim. All I know is that the ridge is patient, and it keeps secrets like the mountains keep water, deep, hidden, and impossible to claim. The glow still appears sometimes at dusk, sometimes at midnight, and I've learned not to chase it. It's not a fire to sit beside, not a place to stay. It's a reminder, a pulse, a small thing in the dark that says, "You're never done observing, never truly safe, never alone up here." Even now, when I hike other trails, the ridge is never far from my mind. Every shadow seems to echo it, every brush of wind feels like it's breathing. And the campers, or whatever they became, I can't say. Sometimes I swear I hear faint voices, laughter that dies just as I turn toward it, and I remind myself to keep moving, keep the distance because some parts of the forest aren't meant to be understood. The ridge is one of those parts. It waits, it watches, and the glow lingers, never quite gone. Always just at the edge of seeing, leaving me with that same knot in my stomach I felt the first time I hiked up there, realizing some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only survived. Story 10. The Silence. After midnight. I'd been patrolling the ridge late that summer, hours past midnight, when the forest seemed to hold its breath all at once. Usually there's a rhythm to the woods at night, the high trill of crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves when the wind brushes through the oaks, the distant hoot of an owl. But that night, every sound vanished. My own breathing seemed too loud, too deliberate, echoing against the dark trunks like it didn't belong. I stopped walking, letting my flashlight beam cut swaths through the darkness, and waited. At first, I thought it was some trick of the mind, exhaustion twisting the familiar sounds into absence, but then I noticed it, a low hum vibrating through the ground beneath my boots. It wasn't mechanical, not the whine of a generator or the hum of power lines. It felt alive, almost like the forest itself was exhaling, slow and rhythmic, just beyond sight. I froze, every nerve straining, trying to identify its source. The hum swelled and softened, rising in a slow crescendo and then fading, carrying a weight I couldn't name. It wasn't melodic, but it had a cadence, a pulse. I wanted to call out, to break the silence with a voice, but my tongue felt heavy. My instincts screamed to move, to flee, but I stayed. The air smelled different too, heavy, almost metallic, as if charged with something unseen pressing against the skin. The hum kept me rooted, vibrating through the soles of my boots and into my chest, and I became aware of my heartbeat, quick and uneven, thumping over the strange rhythm that seemed to fill the entire ridge. Minutes passed. Hours felt like minutes, but then, just as abruptly as it had started, the hum ceased. The forest exhaled once more, this time empty, and normal night sounds crept back slowly. Leaves rustled, a distant owl called, and the gentle murmur of the creek resumed its soft background. Relief swept over me like a wave, but it was hollow. My legs were numb, and my flashlight trembled slightly in my grip. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, close enough to touch, something patient, something that had waited for me to notice it. I retraced my steps back to the ranger cabin, each snapping twig sounding like a shout, every shadow thickening into shape. The next morning, I recounted the experience to one of the senior rangers, a man who had patrolled these mountains longer than I'd been alive. I expected either amusement or skepticism, but instead, he gave me a look I couldn't read and said quietly, "You were lucky it didn't last longer." He refused to explain further, brushing off my questions with a short, clipped tone and a shake of his head. That brief answer haunted me more than the silence ever could. I felt as though I'd touched something I wasn't meant to understand, something older and more patient than any person or animal in the park. For weeks afterward, I checked every corner of the ridge, every hollow in the trees, every creek bend. Nothing. The forest was ordinary again, alive with the usual nocturnal chorus, but I couldn't shake the memory of that hum vibrating beneath my skin. Even when I wasn't in the woods, I'd catch myself imagining it, a soft, pervasive thrum just outside my consciousness. Sleep became uneasy. My dreams carried that low vibration, a sound so persistent it felt like it came from inside my own skull. I woke sweating, heart hammering, convinced that if I closed my eyes for too long, the hum would resume, enveloping me entirely. Years passed. I was transferred to a different section of the park, but I never left the cabin completely. Even in quieter nights, far from the ridge, I'd hear it again, faint and teasing, pressed up against the walls like a visitor waiting patiently, just beyond the threshold of awareness. The first few times, I questioned my mind, blamed it on fatigue or stress, but it became increasingly clear that this hum was not bound by location or time. It returned most often in the moments just before sleep, when the world was still and the air dense, as if it remembered me. It was never loud enough to define or locate, only present, subtle, and insistently unnerving. I've tried to rationalize it, chalk it up to acoustics, to the Earth's natural resonance, to nocturnal animals moving in ways I can't detect, but none of that explains the certainty I felt that first night, or the way the sound seemed to have intention, a cadence that felt aware of me. I've asked other rangers, old-timers who know the forest in ways I will never understand, but most refuse to talk, offering only vague warnings and cryptic advice. Some shake their heads, muttering that I was lucky I heard it at all, as if most who encounter it do not return unchanged. I still live in that cabin. I've grown accustomed to the minor quirks of the forest, the wind through the pines, the distant howl of coyotes, the occasional bear lumbering past. But on nights when the world falls silent, when the crickets stop, and even the wind seems to hesitate, I hold my breath. That low hum starts, subtle, almost imperceptible, vibrating against the walls and under the floorboards, and I remember. It is there and not there, waiting, patient, and I feel small and uncertain, aware that I am being observed by something I can neither see nor comprehend. It leaves a residue of fear, not violent or loud, but insistent, a reminder that the world is larger, older, and more unknowable than I will ever be. Sometimes, I sit by the fire just before sleep, staring into the orange glow of the flames, listening. The hum often follows, just a whisper against the cabin walls, like a memory pressing close. I have learned not to chase it, not to move toward it. It comes and goes, never revealing itself, always leaving me with the same sensation I had that first night, the fragile certainty that the forest is alive in ways I cannot measure, that I have glimpsed a rhythm older than myself, and that some part of it continues to remember me, patient and undisturbed, long after midnight has passed and all else is quiet.